Did you watch it on the television, the last bits of the debate about marriage equality? I thought it was wonderful. And I want to pay tribute as part of the queer community to St. Matthew in the City, who've always been part of that fight, that debate, that gospel truth, that this week another nail was driven in the coffin of prejudice and hatred. I thought it was great. Hope you did. I often wonder what my mother would have made of it. My mother didn't talk about me being queer. She sort of nodded about it occasionally. And I remember once driving in the car with her to yet another garden centre. And she sort of coughed nervously and said, "There's something I want to ask you, dear. Which of you plays the woman?" I thought it was interesting. Which of you plays the woman? I want to tell her there's no playing anymore. We're here and we don't have to play. But I do wonder what my mother would have made of it, because she did like happy endings. She felt cheated if the film or whatever she went to had an open end. And if somebody told her it had an unhappy end, she wouldn't go and see it. Unless the hero and the heroine walked off into the sunset arm in arm, she wasn't really very interested. And I think it's very easy for us to get seduced by the same desire for a happy ending. I think one of the great things about Christianity is the Christian year, when you get these readings that you'd really rather avoid. When you turn over the page and you're reminded that it's Easter and it's resurrection and you've got to make something of it. Or you turn over the page and it's the massacre of the innocents and you have to make something of it. I love the fact that it's not about choosing the nice juicy bits. It's about responding to what's there and trying to make sense of it. That after the blood and the scourging and the nails and the crown of thorns, after we've gone home empty and weeping, at least we know, hopefully, that Easter Sunday can't be far away. We do it every year. I had an aged priest who wanted to put a notice on the church at Easter saying it didn't happen this year, come back next year. It seems to me that if we see Easter in these terms of happy endings, making it all right, then we're in a mess. It's not how it feels. It's not how it is. Nothing, if we're being honest, seems to have been sorted by the resurrection. New life, let's be honest, looks and feels very much like old life. Atrocities continue. Bombs still go off in Boston. Millions are dying of starvation. The sick are still sick and the lonely still lonely. And I, God forsake me, I am still the vulnerable, struggling mess that I've always been. And I believe we're foolish to pretend otherwise. If this Easter season is about resurrection life, then it doesn't seem to be up to much. I've got a problem then preaching an Eastertide, preaching the resurrection as a story with a happy ending. It goes against my experience every day as I see it in the news, in the streets, and in my own heart. Because in the Easter story, we have hate side by side with love. We have good and evil sharing the same stage. The story of the passion and resurrection, I believe, invites us to recognize that love and hate are both part of creation. and always will be. That we are called not to a naive belief that everything has been sorted out at Easter, but the far harder task of recognizing that hate and love inevitably exist, bound up with each other, and we are called to hold both together in our hands and in our world and in our church. And we are called to tolerate this ambivalence. We're called to be able to feel both love and hate at the same time. It doesn't mean that love and hate are locked in some battle to the death, in which eventually love triumphs over hate. That doesn't happen. If you look at the world, it isn't like that. The Passion and the Resurrection are not about some moral victory of life over death. Such a duel between good and evil, God and the devil, leaves us with an inadequate part-object God, a divine prime minister struggling constantly to stay on top of the devilish leader of the opposition. And it leaves us, men and women, as mere political pawns in some horrendous maelstrom, without even having a vote. Easter, I believe, is not about victory, but about transformation. Transformation where hate as well as love, death as well as life must be borne together, as Christ bore them himself. In the acceptance of this, and in the struggle with this, I believe God's transformation is made real. It's not a comforting, ecstatic, magical gift from above, which my mother would have liked, but a discomforting realization that we are the raw material of God's life now. And it's our task, lived out of our creative spirit, which is forever holy, that we face the world as it is and ourselves as we are. That we are called to think and feel and act with no false illusions and no Mickey Mouse theology in which we try to tidy everything up. Difference, hate, failure of love are surmounted at Easter not because love wins in the end, but because love and hate can be tolerated as real. First in the story of the Passion, and then throughout history and throughout the world in all our stories. The pain and the hate of the cross remains throughout Easter and throughout history and throughout the world. It isn't airbrushed out. This inclusion of racked feelings and dashed hopes is motivated not by a compulsion to restore unity and find this happy ending, but out of a desire by all of us to be less resentful, less afraid of anger, less terrified by conflict, less worried about loss, less punitive towards what we desire, less punitive with ourselves. Alongside love and peace and joy and hope and long-suffering, if we are honest about our world and our inner selves, we also find hate. We also find fear and violence and jealousy and loathing and anger. It's part of you and me, isn't it? Here at Easter, we are invited into the reality of God and of God's creation of which we are part, as it is, not how we would like to pretend it is. At Easter we are given a chance in the story of the cross and empty tomb to go beneath the surface of the world as we wish it to be, below the surface of how we as people would like to be seen, to go beneath it and even embrace what we find there. For in this God-created story of resurrection, in our God-created selves, we find all this, the love and joy and peace and hope and long-suffering and hate and fear and anger and jealousy. The abused and the abuser, the terrorist and the terrified, the powerful and the powerless, the crowd and the lonely, the loved of God and the abandoned of God. I'm inviting you in this Easter season to risk this Easter story. To risk your story, my story, just as it is, so that here, just for a moment, we can attempt together to meet and welcome hints of the truth of God and ourselves. A chance to understand ourselves a little bit better. The story of death and resurrection and our story come together in a moment at Easter. Mirrored here in bread and wine. God in God's self-making, God in God's total self-making, communion with us. In our total selves, the loving and the hateful, the frightened and the vicious, the peaceful and the violent, the lonely and the gregarious. This is where our Easter celebration begins each year, where the Alleluias can start, perhaps more muted, but perhaps more realistic, perhaps more true to God and to ourselves. And then all we can do is struggle on, till we discover that Easter is not about the transformation of hate, but rather the transformation of ourselves and the transformation of our world, as we risk holding together as honestly as we can both love and hate, death and life, despair and hope, as they were held together in the person of the Christ on the cross. Something then might happen to transform everything. Wait and see.